What's up, everyone? Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast episode. I'm recording this after hours when baby is asleep, so hopefully you guys don't hear too much background noise. And I'm speaking a little bit closer in the microphone today to make sure that my voice is loud enough for the audio quality for this podcast. So appreciate you guys tuning in. For today's episode, I want to talk more about creating marketing OKRs. I want to talk about some best practices for creating OKRs, as well as some tactical marketing examples for an overarching marketing OKR, as well as individual department KPIs, or in this sense, OKRs, and then specifically on demand gen in and of itself. And so let's dive in. OKRs stand for objectives and key results, and they are essentially a goal-setting framework that is used by businesses and organizations to track and to set up and to track progress towards specific objectives, or in other words, specific KPIs. It's kind of like just like another measuring tool or a measuring system for objectives and KPIs and measurements and results. And so normally the process for OKRs consists of about two components, which is broken into the abbreviation of OKRs for objectives and key results. So objectives are the specific, like, measurable goal that the company has for themselves. So think about if I'm creating an objective for this podcast episode, if I'm creating for an objective for a specific tactic, if I'm creating an objective for a specific piece of content, the key results are essentially like the KPIs that we want to achieve from that. So they're going to be the specific and measurable outcomes that should be derived from this objective and the whole purpose of us doing this initiative. And really, OKRs, they were created for the sense of transparency and alignment so that everybody within the organization can clearly see into these objectives from all the different organizations and all the different departments and see how everybody's efforts contributes towards like one larger goal. So think of it, for example, sorry, my allergies are like really flaring up right now, so excuse me. Think of it as almost like a flow chart. Think of it as you have, or maybe even an org chart, if you will, from a visual perspective, if you haven't worked with OKRs before. You have like one top box that has different branches that then branch downward, and those individual branches then branch downward even more and even more and even more. So essentially, the structure of OKRs should look similar to that org structure that I just described, where the CEO or the senior executive or senior leadership puts together their top level business objectives. And then from there, the individual departments then roll in their departmental OKRs. And then individually from there, you can break that down to the individual contributors on what their OKRs are set up and how it rolls into the marketing department or the sales department or the customer success department or whatever department, right? And then those departments roll into that larger, say, go-to-market OKR or that larger business objective OKR. So it all rolls upwards and rolls downwards together pretty seamlessly. And a fun fact, I don't know if you guys know this, I actually used to be head of demand gen at a specific OKR company. It was called BetterWorks, if you guys have heard of them. So I was personally held responsible for building and leading my own OKRs for demand gen. And so this episode today is derived on just my experience within that and also helping other teams define their OKRs based on the strategy that we're building together. So the first thing to dive into when building your OKRs, I think there's a 6-step process, I think, like from a best practice perspective on building OKRs. And the very first thing that you should do is actually like define your objectives. You should start by defining the high-level objectives that you actually want to achieve. So this goes back to, if we go back to that org chart, like what is it that like the business is actually wanting to do? Like make an OKR objective that is clear, concise, and specific, and that overall like aligns to the actual tactical business outcomes of what we're wanting to achieve and the expectations for the other teams that now will roll into this OKR. The second best practice is to make sure that you are not only defining that objective, but now you're also breaking that down by key results, which is the whole purpose of the abbreviation for OKR. So once we've identified what that objective should be, we should then figure out how we're going to hold ourselves accountable to that, and like what are the specific measurable key results that tie into this objective that we are trying to achieve. The third thing is then to ensure alignment. If you're a marketing leader, it's then to align with the rest of the go-to-market team or perhaps your CEO on your expectations for the marketing team. I believe that this should be done first before sharing it with your marketing team, because then if the team derives their OKRs and then the marketing leader comes back and says, just kidding, we're going to pivot, we're actually going to go in a different direction, the team isn't necessarily doing those OKRs more than once and, kind of just wasting their time doing that. Not that OKRs are a waste of time, but doing the multiple revisions almost mindlessly is a waste of time. And truthfully, it took a good chunk of my time to create OKRs because you want to make sure that you're methodical, you're concise, you actually have some data points behind it for your key results and like what good looks like and like what we're trying to achieve and putting some actual numbers behind that. And so sometimes you have to go in and pull reports and then you have to forecast those results. So it can take a good chunk of time to really create meaningful OKRs. And that's the beauty of it, is that because they're meaningful, because they're set up with a purpose, that the team has that alignment and transparency and we're all working towards the same goal. They take a little bit of thought to carefully craft, but I think for good reason, they can be a really great starting point for a lot of team members. So my recommendation for the marketing leaders is to make sure that you have that alignment from kind of like the top down before you go on and share it off with your team to then build their individual OKRs to align with now yours. The fourth thing is to then make them achievable but challenging. So we want to strive for a really good outcome. We want to be able to make sure that we're pushing ourselves to achieve the best possible results, but we don't want to aim for something that is entirely unrealistic, and we also don't want to sell ourselves short. I don't recall the specific like best practice percentage. I want to say it was something like 70-30 maybe. So don't hold me accountable to that one, but it's similar within that ratio where it's like we want to make sure that we're hitting 70% of it and leaving 30% for growth and error and optimization. So we need to make sure that it's actually somewhat achievable and that we get progress or we're making progress in that direction, but we don't always have to hit 100% of our OKRs every single time, because then it's almost like what are we even doing it for? So making sure that we're setting expectations that are not unrealistic, but are also that they seem achievable, so that everything kind of seems within reach and we're still able to challenge ourselves in our day-to-day while pushing for this end result. The fifth thing is to make sure that we're actively reviewing and tracking that progress. So again, I was working with a specific OKR software. And so part of us, drinking that Kool-Aid and practicing what we preach was to create our own OKRs and to input it into that proprietary software. And making sure that we are on, I think it was a weekly basis, we would go in and we would update our OKRs to review and track the progress on how we're pacing. And sometimes for marketing tactics and marketing strategies, a week is too soon to measure things. You have these really big, large strategies, you have these really big, large goals, and then you're being asked on how they're being reported on a weekly basis. So I think part of this is also setting up that expectation on when we can achieve those results. Best practice for creating OKRs should be quarterly. I know we did ours quarterly as well, mostly because so many things change and are fluid and pivot throughout about a quarter. And so really making sure that we're working almost in like stretches or almost like pilots where we're coming in and we're we're creating what we think is going to work for that quarter, and then we analyze and we rinse and we repeat. So making sure that you're taking that portion of the analysis section and tracking your progress on how we're pacing, whether weekly, bi-weekly, at a minimum, like monthly, kind of checking in into those portals and seeing how that team is aligned with the objectives and the OKRs that we initially set up for. The sixth thing for a best practice for OKRs is to make sure that others are also reviewing it and that it's being updated as well. And so if, for example, the marketing leader creates one OKR and then halfway through the quarter, we realize that we actually need to be going a different direction, like we need to update that OKR. So this is different than just tracking the weekly progress on how we're pacing against that OKR. We also need to say, okay, instead of this one, we're going to scrap it and we're going to add this as an OKR. It's totally fine for OKRs to be fluid. It's totally fine for them to change. It's totally fine to delete one and to add another, or to add additional key results as you go. The purpose, I think, is more to just stay organized and to have something that's documented that the team can work towards, more so than it being like a set it and forget it, and now all of a sudden we're ingrained into these objectives that we have to achieve. It shouldn't be that rigid. It should be very fluid. It should enable the team to track their progress progressively, but then also be able to have the flexibility to say, hey, listen, like this just ain't working. Like we've got to go in a different direction, and be able to then make that change and make that adjustment for what that change should actually be. So those are the best practices for OKRs. So when it comes to creating OKRs for marketing, the sole purpose of today's podcast episode, but as this is the Demand Gen Made Simple podcast, I never want to assume that anybody has full knowledge of breadth and coverage of any topic that I like to discuss. So I always like to start from the tippity top. So creating OKRs for marketing. The way that I have appreciated my marketing leader creating OKRs, and the way that I like to take as a best practice for creating marketing specific OKRs, is to always tie it back to that high level marketing strategy. So when we talked about that org chart, about it starting from the very tippity top, and then breaking out into smaller branches and then smaller branches and the smaller branches all the way throughout the journey, when we start from the business core objectives of what the business is trying to achieve, then every department after that creates their own internal department-related OKRs that are aligned with the company achieving that set of OKRs. And so it's very critical, as we talked about, to have that marketing leader create that marketing strategy of what that marketing team is tasked and hired to do, both within that quarter and, within the duration of their employment. But it's also from an OKR specific standpoint to create your OKRs in relation to that marketing strategy. So again, everything rolls upward and everything rolls downward. And so starting with what are we actually trying to achieve from a marketing perspective should be the basis for how you derive your OKRs, whether you're in content, whether you're in design, whether you're in demand gen, whatever role you are within marketing, it starts with that overarching marketing strategy, because at the end of the day, everybody contributes to what we're trying to achieve. As marketing progresses, I think every quarter is a good time to really analyze. So when we create that marketing strategy, going back and looking at what we're trying to achieve either quarterly or for H1 or H2, so the first half of the year or the back half of the year, I think it always makes sense for marketing to be measured at a minimum quarterly, right? So being able to have some sort of OKRs that they can pace against for quarterly, because that gives us a good about a 3-month trial to then understand what's working, what's not working, how are we actually pacing towards these goals. And so when it comes to building a specific, like some examples for building OKRs for a marketing strategy, let's take, for example, that the marketing team for this quarter is looking to boost credibility in the market. What should OKRs look like for each specific department if the marketing strategy is to boost credibility? So for example, content could have OKRs on the output of creating new pieces of content to contribute to boosting that credibility. maybe creating a specific number of thought leadership pieces, or maybe having a specific number of guest speaking sessions or guest podcast sessions, or creating a flagship product, not a product, a flagship event that can then help boost that level of credibility. Maybe it's helping the team create customer testimonial videos or pulling some ROI stats, or whatever it is that that company and that team identifies would help boost that credibility, would be something that then the content team can then say, hey, I can help create those pieces of content. From a design standpoint, they could be tasked with maybe auditing the brand image. Sometimes if they're testing a different approach to imagery, we could talk about how imagery can play in boosting credibility, right? So for example, if we're wanting to move from stock imagery to more like in-house photography, all those things could essentially boost credibility when a brand is perceived from a design standpoint. For demand gen specifically, say for example, again, overarching strategies that we want to boost credibility and trust in the market. Say for example that a demand gen team is going to be tasked with increasing website traffic. We want to be able to say that we are it when it comes to somebody looking for the next set of trends or advice on how-tos. Like our website should be that hub where people go to trust, to boost their knowledge and to boost their level of expertise as well. We could also look at some data points around data engagement. If people are actually engaging with our content for the emails that we're sending, or even events engagements, if we're doing monthly webinars or if we're doing weekly podcasts, to see what that level of credibility is from our audience, not only from the market if we're doing like paid ad spend, but then also from our own database and engagement. Like if we truly have thought leadership and credibility within the market, our database should be reflective of that. And so those are some examples for the demand gen team. Another one is improving conversion rates. Sometimes if boosting bottom line revenue is important, we should also look at how we can increase our conversion rates too. So I guess in summary, regardless of what the actual objectives are for the marketing team or the company as a whole, a critical component to creating OKRs for marketing specifically is to tie it back to the company's business objectives. So making sure that everything rolls upward and everything rolls downward. So I've talked about a lot about companies' objectives. If you followed my journey, both on LinkedIn or podcast or newsletter, whichever way, you know that I'm always like, we've got to find a way to tie marketing back to tangible business objectives. And of course, when it comes to OKRs and for marketing as a whole, some things by nature are just more abstract than others. But I'll conclude with this thought for you all. The sole reason, or better yet, the sole purpose of creating this specific marketing tactic should be to contribute to that larger business strategy. So if we can formulate our OKRs and a marketing plan to align in that direction, that's how I recommend that marketing teams structure and create their OKRs. Thanks for tuning in.